Hello, my fellow engineers. We're back with episode 4 of how to build a scalable Python application. In the previous episode, we created our application setup that will connect us to the Postgres database we built in episode 2. In this episode, we'll test that connection. So let's go through today's ticket. When we build an application, then we need to properly test it so that we know that the system is robust. So for the acceptance criteria, firstly, we'll alter the role to user password on the database. Then we're going to modify the HBA file to force password usage. Then we'll create directories for unit and integration tests in the test suite. We'll add a conftest.py file for the fixtures. And then we will write some tests for our application setup, which we created in the last episode. So let's head to our terminal and alter our role with the password. Let's go ahead and type psql and enter. Then in order to alter our role, we simply type alter user, then add your username. Mine is Alex, but yours will be whatever you set up in episode 2. And then we'll say with password, and then finally we're going to add a string for our password. I'm just going to put test, semicolon, and enter. So you should then see alter role pop up. This means it's been applied. Now we need to force the usage of a password by altering our HBA file. HBA stands for host-based authentication. I'll leave the link to this documentation in the description below if you want to read more. To find your HBA file, you can actually just type show HBA file, semicolon, and enter. So we'll just exit out of this. And then we can open that file with Vim, and paste the path and enter. And then we can scroll to the bottom of this file and see our configuration. Yours may look slightly different, and if it does, just pause the video and copy this into your HBA file, and then we can continue. Alternatively, you can read through the Medium article that I've linked in the description, and you can copy it from there. But essentially, what we want to do is change this all here to require a password. There are a few different ways that we can do this. We could add an MD5 hash, for example, but for this case, I'm just going to ask it to require a password. So if I press A, I can insert, and let's scroll up to where the method is and replace trust on the lines with all with password. Now if I press escape and press colon, W for write, Q for quit, and then enter. So now that's all done, all that's left to do is restart Postgres to confirm our changes have been applied. So we can do that with brew services restart Postgres. Now let's open psql again and see if it requires password. So now we can just enter our password and we're in. Moving on, as always, we firstly need to create our new branch to work on. So first I'm going to do git checkout main, and then I'm going to pull our changes. So you can see the changes there from the last episode. Let's just clear some space. And then I'm going to do git checkout -b for a new branch, and then ticket -4. Now let's open our IDE with our project. We were asked to create a unit and integration directory in our test suite, so let's do that. Before we start our tests, let's just have a look at the application setup we created in the previous episode. We start our function by getting some database credentials and configuration from environment variables. We'll be changing these in our tests so that we can check the changes we made to the HBA file earlier have gone through. Then we initialize our app and the database and return them. Because this will be testing another service's interaction with our code, this is what we call an integration test. We'll be using Pytest for testing, and Pytest naming convention requires us to start the names of tests and test files with, you guessed it, test. I wonder how many times I'm going to say test in this series. Anyway, we'll add a Python file called test application setup inside our integration. Yes, we'll add that to Git. And finally, we need to import our application setup. So from shop import application setup. Now let's start our testing. So first we'll test for the happy path. So just define test underscore application setup. And we'll add a doc string in here. So here we're just checking the database connection is active with correct details. If you remember from episode 2, when we set up the database, we actually created a table called clothesstock, and we'll be accessing this to test the connection. So we'll just have So next, let's get our app and our database from our application setup. Now we can start our assertions. The first thing I want to do is check that the bind URL from the database is the same as we configured in the application. So for this, we can assert, app.config, and then here this will be our SQL alchemy, database, URI. Let's wrap it in a string, session.url. We have to wrap this in a string because the URL is actually a URL type. Then let's test the connection of the session by just executing some simple SQL statement. Remember, we added some data in our table, so this can be accessed. When running these sorts of integration tests, typically you would have a test environment set up, or you would add data to that test environment per test, wiping it clean for every test. But for this project, I just want to keep it as simple as possible. So let's assert session.execute, and then here we're going to do select star from, and then we need to f-string this, and we're going to just add our table name here. So now we can run this test in the terminal. So let's go back to our terminal. We'll just clear some space here. Firstly, I'm just going to cd into the close shop, and then because we're using pipenv, we can just simply say pipenv run pytest, and then we can set test and our integration here and press enter. And there you go, we have a passing test. Now, because this is an integration test, actually what we can test is whether or not this would pass regardless of if we're connected to Postgres. So actually what I'm going to do is turn off Postgres. So we do that by brew services stop Postgres. And then I'm just going to tab up to the previous pipenv from Pytest test integration. And there you go, you can see the error here. So let's clear some space. Let's get Postgres back up and running. So we do that by brew services start Postgres, and we can continue. So now let's do some unhappy tests. Earlier in this episode, we forced the users with passwords in our Postgres configuration. So we want to check that that works. So let's do test application setup with incorrect password. And let's add a doc string. So check the database connection throws a programming error using an incorrect password. So as before, we still need our table name, but we also need to change the environment variable of our Postgres password. And we'll just set that to incorrect password. Then we'll do the same as the previous test and get the DB in application, so we can just copy that from the previous test. We'll also do the same assertion as previous test to check the database URI. However, when we run this test, there should be a programming error that should occur. So what we can do, using a context manager, using the with statement, we can use pytest.phrases and then add our programming error there, and then we can execute our statement as we did before. And what this should do is this should catch our programming error. So like before, we can go back to our terminal and we can write pipenv run pytest, and we can just test the new tests there. And there you go, 2 passing tests. And for our final test, we're going to check that our database can't be accessed by an invalid user. So this is another unhappy path, and it's important to make sure that we check unhappy paths because it mitigates bugs, and in this case reduces our security risk. So we'll do find test application setup with invalid user, and then a doc string. So we're checking database connection throws a programming error, and an invalid user is used. So again, we've got our table name. And for our environment variable, we're going to change the PG username. And we'll just set that as invalid user. And from there, we can simply copy and paste the previous test. Now let's go back to our terminal and run those 3 tests. So there we go, 3 tests passed. Before we commit our changes, let's quickly go through the definition of done. So for our acceptance criteria, we altered the role to use a password, which we did. We modified the HBA configuration file to force a password usage, which we also did. We created directories for unit and integration tests in the test suite, and we created a comp test file for the fixtures. Although, having just read this, we did not add a comp test file for the unit test. So let's just quickly go back and add that. And yes, we'll add that too. So it's a really good thing to go through the definition of done to make sure that you've accomplished everything in your ticket. So now we've added the conf test py file for the fixtures, and we also created tests for the application setup. Now we didn't just do one test, we did multiple tests, both the happy and unhappy part. So that's great, we've done that. Let's get our changes committed. So let's go to our terminal and we'll just do a git status to check what's changed. So in here we can see our changes. We've added the conf test files to our integration and unit directories. We have added our test application setup.py. Ignore our modified pip file.lock. You probably won't have this. This is just a PyCharm updating my pip file.lock. We also have a modified down here that is not staged for our commit. So what we'll do is we'll just do a git add -u for update everything that's not in our git ignore. And then we'll run git status. So we'll clear some space. We'll run git status again. And then we can see everything there is what we expect to be. Right, so let's clear some space. Now we can commit our changes. So let's do git commit -m for message, and we'll add our message in here. So we added tests for application setup. And then what we want to do is just push that up to GitHub. So git push and enter. Let's copy this. Let's clear some space and we will push that. Okay, and there we go. So if we go to our GitHub repo for our clone shop, we can compare and pull request here. We can see our changes if we scroll down. So there's our tests. And here we're just going to add our changes that we made. So when we have an application setup, we test. So when we have an application setup, then we need to test so that we can make sure our application setup is robust. And the changes we've made here are so happy path test, application setup, using defaults, and then we had an unhappy path test, changing our password, environment variable. We also had an unhappy path test for changing our user. And that's it. So we can create our pull request here. And as always, because we are the code owners, we can actually just merge this pull request in and delete your branch. So that's it for today's episode. Next time we'll be creating a model of our database using SQL Alchemy. I hope you found this useful, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next one.